So good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. So there's a few more people arriving in now, but I think it's probably a good idea. We've a busy morning, so maybe it's a good idea that we just move ahead. So again, welcome to this morning's webinar on climate and energy research. So this is actually the 10th annual joint ESRI UCC Energy Conference. And as those of you who've been with us for a good number of years, you'll know that this conference is sort of based around the strong research partnership that exists between the ESRI and UCC, specifically in the context of the MaREI Research Centre. So this is, again, as I said, a long-standing partnership that we're very, very proud of, bringing the expertise of the energy engineers, primarily from UCC, and the climate and energy economists at the ESRI. So as I said, we've had this very, very productive collaboration for many years, and this day always, in a sense, sort of symbolizes and brings out the best when we have the discussion about the work being done in both locations. So as ever, I mean, this goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway. The issues we're discussing today, of course, are enormously important. I was just reflecting on this. Actually, I was putting my sort of brief words together. I mean, I started the ESRI in 1994. And climate, of course, was considered an important issue at the time, but it had a sort of a medium-term stroke long-term perspective. And of course, in the sort of the intervening years, the scale of the crisis has obviously sort of become more and more acute. And that notion of this being a sort of a long-term issue, I think we started changing it, and our thinking became more medium-term. And of course, now we're thinking that, well, this is more of a short-term issue, and sort of parallel to that sort of compression of the time scale. I know, as a sort of a naive young economist about 25 years ago, I would have sat sort of arrogantly, almost sort of assuming that economics knew the answer to all this. It was simply the imposition of a carbon tax, and everything else was going to flow quite nicely from that, and there wasn't too much to worry about. You know, for a variety of reasons, you could say that the non-imposition of a carbon tax many years ago means that the sort of you know, actions that were needed to address the issue didn't happen. And I think we're now in a situation, you know, where people like me, who would have had that sort of naive carbon tax based view of many years ago, the carbon tax is still really important, but I think we're clearly now at the point where sort of massive action at a sort of a centralized governmental level is now also required, you know, just because of the timescale and the sheer size of the challenge. So, you know, my thinking in these areas has sort of evolved, and it's always been great to sort of sit at these conferences and to see the sort of evolution in thinking. I've just learned so much over the years, and I'm expecting to do that again today. Of course, today we're talking about, you know, climate is there and is enormously important. The issue of energy security was something that often came up at our conferences, but of course there's a sort of a renewed focus on that at the moment for very obvious reasons. Also very interesting debates on the one hand, where some people seem to imply there's a clash between the energy security issue and the climate issue, with discussions around the need to sort of not just continue relying on fossil fuel, but possibly to even sort of increase demand for fossil fuel with the reopening of plants that might have been closed down previously. So on the one hand, there's that apparent conflict between the security and climate issues, but also, of course, there is the possibility to look at this a little bit differently and start thinking about, for example, accelerated move towards renewables, reductions in energy demand, where you get a sort of a neater matching of objectives in terms of security and climate on the other. So again, those are some of the issues that are going to be teased through today. We have a very nice program, and again, I want to congratulate the organisers. It's a really nicely balanced program. So we're talking the sessions, climate, security, and energy demand. So a lot of the sort of the themes that we typically be worrying about, they're going to be captured very well today. And as I said, I've learned so much over the years in these conferences, and I'm expecting to learn an awful lot more again today. There's just two more points I want to make, and this is specifically about UCC. The first is essentially just to congratulate. I'll sort of congratulate Brian Ó Gallachóir directly, but more broadly, for people who sort of follow Cork, be it through social media or otherwise, there's been a real sort of strong emphasis on sustainability issues across the university. I've had the pleasure of, for example, sitting on interview boards, whatever, where people have been hired in to look at these sort of specific issues. But I think the university deserves an amount of congratulations for focusing in on the sustainability issue and really bringing forward research and programs and everything like that match that. And again, from an ESRI perspective, it's great to be connected. And the second thing I want to say is just a word of thanks. I was given a task a number of weeks ago by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications to look at issues around energy security, particularly modelling and data issues. I was given the task, but it was great to be able to reach out to the colleagues in UCC for their assistance in the task. We've talked for many, many years about the importance of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary research and the benefits that can flow from that. And this was a real example where policymakers had a request that required a number of people from different disciplines to be engaged in the sort of the modelling and the analysis of the issues. And anyway, I was very grateful to the colleagues in Cork for assisting me with that particular task. So very much looking forward to the day. And but before we get into the details of the day, it's my great pleasure to hand over to my colleague Brian Ó Gallachóir, and Brian will talk on behalf of UCC MaREI. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and good morning to everyone and welcome to this event. Just a few short words to add to Alan's introduction. I think from our perspective in UCC, the collaboration has been hugely beneficial, and as Alan mentioned, we effectively bring an energy engineering dimension that really complements the ESRI focus on economics, and it's through the combination of different disciplinary perspectives that we can make great progress, in my view. And another interesting, I suppose, focus of our collaboration is not just research for research's sake, but research that can usefully inform policy and decision making. And I'm very pleased that we have a number of colleagues from the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications who will be chairing the different sessions that we have today. And the interaction of research to inform policy decisions, I think, was really brought home to us, the importance of that, particularly during the COVID pandemic. And I think it would be important to see what learnings we can get from those processes and the establishment of different mechanisms to translate, essentially in a rapid way, in an urgent way, to translate the findings from research into insights that the policy system can use. And this is something that's critically important in the context of climate change. I think if we reflect on the last 2 years in Ireland, we've this significant change politically in terms of a strong leadership position in terms of ambition on climate action. And we've seen this most prominently through the legislation last year that was overwhelmingly voted in favour of, both in the Dáil and the Seanad, to essentially Ireland setting a target that was the second highest in the world in terms of climate ambition, after only Denmark. The other thing I just wanted to reflect on is as Alan mentioned, we've had this long focus on climate action. Energy security is something we've also had a focus on. It's been less prominent in terms of, I suppose, policy discourse and public discourse until more recently with the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, and now this questioning at EU level about how do we rapidly wean ourselves off the imports of oil and gas in particular from Russia. And that leads very nicely to the third theme of today, which is on energy demand, because it's it's in energy demand reduction that we can perhaps make some of the more rapid changes in terms of reducing emission and also reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. But none of this is easy. It does require, now that we have the ambition at political level and the policy framework through the carbon budgets, what really needs to happen is a societal transition, a societal transformation. And this will require, of course, not just the engineering and economics, but a sectoral-wide, societal-wide engagement with this. And again, I think there are learnings from what we experienced during the difficult 2 years of the COVID pandemic, where people effectively came on board in order to protect others. They came on board in terms of the hygiene measures that were suggested by the health authorities, face mask wearing, etc., and then the vaccination program. We saw a very significant high level of engagement in Ireland in those. And again, there's learnings that we can draw from those experiences in order to see how we might address the dual challenges we have now of reducing emissions while improving and maintaining energy security. So I want to thank the ESRI for hosting the webinar. It's as Alan says, I always find these events very fruitful in terms of the discussions, and I would welcome people's engagement and participation through the Q&A function. So we've always had very healthy discussions. It's not just about us sharing our findings, it's the discussions after each presentation that's also very rich, but that will depend on everyone's engagement in that process. So I would encourage you to ask freely and ask often questions as they arise to you based on what you're hearing or reflections you have on the current context and challenges. So with those few words, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Karen Egan from the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, who's going to chair the first session, which focuses on climate action. Karen, thanks very much for taking on this role this morning, and I'm delighted to hand over to you.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm Karen Egan from DEC, and you will be aware that the economy-wide carbon budgets were legally adopted on the 6th of April, and my team is currently preparing the sectoral emission ceilings, and UCC and MaREI have been providing technical advice to the department on the ceilings. So I will be chairing the first session on climate action, and just to introduce the speakers, the first presentation will be by Professor Hannah Daley, Professor of Sustainable Energy in UCC, lead developer of the TIM model, which is supporting DEC through the capacity project. And Dr. Olexandr Balyk, Research Fellow in Energy Systems Modelling at UCC and MaREI, and Senior Developer of the TIM model. Then the second presentation will be by Professor Ó Gallachóir, Professor and Chair of Energy Engineering at UCC, Director of SFI MaREI Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. And then the third presentation will be Dr. Fionn Rogan, Senior Research Fellow in the Energy Systems Modelling at UCC and MaREI and lead developer of the LEAP model. And then also Dr. Tomas, postdoctoral researcher in Energy Systems Modelling at UCC and MaREI. And then in terms of Q&A, we will take all questions at the end of the three speakers. Please put your questions in the Q&A function. You don't have to wait until Q&A time to do that. And also please note that upvoting of questions will be available. So with that, I will hand over to Professor Hannah Daley. Thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing what the three presenters have to say.
Thank you very much, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's great to see some familiar faces, familiar names, and looking forward to the discussion and the day ahead. Please shout if you can't see my slides or if they don't move. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of Ireland's carbon budgets and energy system pathways, which may be needed to meet our climate objectives. So stepping back, looking at Ireland's history of greenhouse gas emissions, I find it interesting that we're now just over halfway between 1990 and 2050. 2050 will come very quickly. And with the 3.6% fall in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're now basically back to where we were in 1990 in terms of emissions. With the legally adopted carbon budgets, which were recommended by the Climate Change Advisory Council and adopted by all parties in the Dáil late last year, Carbon Budget 1 and Carbon Budget 2 require very, very rapid fall in emissions, so 4.8% per year annually this in this carbon budget, and up to 8.3% over the next 5 years. And this concept of cumulative carbon budgets is a scientifically valid way of representing our target rather than end year targets, because every bit of CO2 that we emit accumulates in the atmosphere and will stay there for centuries to millennia, causing permanent damage to the climate. And that's why we have to have a budget or a quota approach. And before I go to what happens after that, I want to take a step back and look at what derived those carbon budgets, or how we might think of those carbon budgets. So this is a slide which looks at Ireland's remaining share of the global carbon budget relative to these adopted budgets. So if we take the global carbon budget, the global remaining carbon budget, which is compatible with various temperature rises, so 1.5 degree, 1.7 or 2 degrees, according to the IPCC's AR6 Working Group 1 report. These have been actually updated recently with the Working Group 3 report. If you downscale those on a per capita basis from 2020, this is where we are with the carbon budgets. So even after Carbon Budget 1 and Carbon Budget 2 are those emissions are emitted, those are more than a 50% probability of meeting a 1.5 degree target. So this is oh, sorry, actually, wait a second. This is, no, sorry, this is the 2020 base year. I made a mistake there. So if you downscale the global carbon budget, which is around 500 gigatons of CO2 for a 50% chance of 1.5 degrees, Carbon Budget 1 and Carbon Budget 2 on a per capita basis pretty much get us there. If we look at a 2 degree, if we're kind of comfortable with a 2 degree temperature rise, which I think it's clear that we shouldn't be comfortable with that, there's a bigger window. And if we downscale from a 2015 base year, that is, since 2015, we have been emitting more than the global average, and so our kind of remaining carbon budget will be lower than the global average. So I think that this basically points to the fact that the adopted carbon budgets are really the absolute minimum that we should be planning to achieve for a safe and equitable future climate. So even though they will be extremely difficult to reach and they'll require every person, every organization, every part of society kind of pulling together to meet them, they're really the minimum of what we need to do. So the question that we are supporting is, what will it take for the energy system to meet these carbon budgets? And as part of the team in UCC, been very proud to develop this new Times Ireland model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Irish Times model. So we sent that to the retirement home for old models, as sometimes models have to be done. And we undertook a very deep kind of renovation of the model and built it from scratch to take into account new developments in modeling platforms, but also the energy technology and energy policy landscape, especially this very new steep decarbonisation target. So what this model does is look at energy system maps to inform climate policy, what is feasible and what will it cost across all parts of energy supply and energy demand in an integrated way. So we give the model what the climate policy constraints are, what energy demand dynamics are, what the future evolution of technologies is, the future geopolitical outlook, for example, energy prices are very important at the moment, and feasible growth rates. And then with this least cost linear optimization approach, it calculates what the energy flows and investments across all these technologies are, what the emissions trajectories by sector, by technology over time, what the total system cost is, what the marginal abatement cost is. And also we have we consider anything costing over 2,000 euros a tonne as unmitigated, as we call it backstop technology. And we've placed a very strong emphasis on transparency and accessibility. The model is freely available to download on GitHub. The documentation paper is peer reviewed in an open way and is about to be published. And we've got an interactive results dashboard where you can play with the different levers and look at the different options across demand and supply to meet various different levels of carbon budgets for the energy system. And I want to take a step back again and think a little bit about why do we model. I think about models like as maps. So maps don't give a single answer where to go. They don't give you a set of instructions. It gives you, I suppose, the evidence base or a tool in order to consider your options. So it's a way to gather your best assumptions and information about a particular landscape in a downscaled way, to facilitate discussion and to give you the evidence base for decision making. A map shouldn't just give you one single answer. It should give you a tool on which to develop answers together. And so these energy systems optimization models provide this big picture approach, this sort of global overview, a kind of a low detail map, I suppose, but with an overview of all the different sectors and how they fit together to help prevent blind spots, to make sure that we're making the best of all options considered. For example, we have a limited availability of sustainable bioenergy resource in the country. Where is the best place to use that? Is it in transport? Is it in industry? Is it in the power sector? Respecting these national constraints. And it's important to consider system-wide dynamics and trade-offs, because you can enact a policy in the transport sector, which has implications for the residential sector in terms of competing for low carbon technologies or in terms of supply. And then it's really important to develop this capacity. So I like to think of model users as being people who are, I suppose, educated to read a map and to ask good questions from a map, as well as the modelers themselves, which are the kind of academics and researchers like the cartographers who are making the map to dynamically update and maintain the models. Because as you go forward in a journey, you learn more and you need to update your decision basis. Okay, so models basically help us to make these meaningful, consistent narratives of energy system transformation. So I want to share with you one of the pathways, an illustrative decarbonisation trajectory that it will take over the next decade, and it's actually over only 8 years at this stage, to meet the carbon budgets. So this is one illustrative pathway. It's not a definitive one, but it is something that would be required, one pathway to meet the 2021 Climate Action Plan and the carbon budgets. And that it's clear that all sectors have to reach or exceed the most ambitious of the range as set out in the 2021 Climate Action Plan. So many of you are familiar with, agriculture was given a range of 22 to 30%, the power sector 70 to 80%, and so on. And here we assume in this scenario, we assume that agriculture meets the top of its range, 30%, and then all other sectors, which are mainly in the energy system, have to meet over 60% reduction in their emissions. And then we use the Times Ireland model to look at how, what are the kind of milestones along the way of this particular pathway that we would need to meet that mitigation target. And we can look in this particular pathway, we would have, say, no new internal combustion engine, ICE, van or car sales by 2027, and a 20% blend of biodiesel. And we would have private car use declining by 20% by 2030. For the residential sector, we'd have a steep reduction in domestic oil demand with deep retrofits and heat electrification, focusing on those kind of energy and carbon intensive one-off houses, 10% fall in natural gas use in buildings, and no domestic peat or coal use from 2025. Process emissions from cement captured with CCS by 2030, or a big reduction in cement demand, or both, and a 30% of industry energy demand with domestic bioenergy. And then you'll see, I think anyone in the power sector here who's in the audience might fall off their chair, because in this particular, again, this is just one illustrative pathway. We see almost a fully decarbonized power sector by 2028, and that is an assumption to the model that that's possible. Now we also have scenarios where that is not achieved. So we don't model in detail what happens in the agriculture sector, but this is what needs to add up in order to meet the overall carbon budgets. And if any one of those little boxes is not possible, we need to find additional emission savings from somewhere else. So if you kind of think that any one of those things is very, very difficult, we need to find something else which will also be very, very difficult. So, and it's also clear that technology switches alone will not be enough. So a broad suite of measures to lower demand and develop new technology solutions is necessary. So it's not technology deployment or demand reduction or innovation, it's all three of those things. And then we also look at what if the agriculture sector doesn't meet 30%, what if it only meets 22%, which is the lower range of its ceiling. And then we can see what extra effort has to come from the energy system. And these are screenshots from our web app, which can be explored. So for example, if we reduce the sectoral carbon budgets, the marginal abatement cost goes from around 700 euros a tonne in the second carbon budget period to around 1,000 euros a tonne in 2030. So these are some of the highest marginal abatement costs in the world. Extremely rapid energy system decarbonisation, and a short kind of turnover of technologies means this carbon marginal abatement cost is very, very high. It requires energy system emissions to fall to 13 million tonnes in 2030, so reducing by 68% with extra effort across all sectors, and cumulative upfront investment in addition to no mitigation to meet sectoral budgets is an extra 10 billion euros if we have a higher ambition for the energy system. And so this is I suppose some of the kind of highlights. Again, higher marginal abatement costs across all sectors, nearly zero carbon power system, cement process emissions captured, a very large reduction in oil consumption, housing, and a big push for domestic bioenergy supply. And I mean, if we're required an upfront, if we look at not just the kind of annualized investment, but the upfront investment required to meet this transformation, an extra 60 billion euros this decade, in addition to business as usual, mainly the power sector, residential, and the transport sectors. That is a hugely vast sum, which creates financial challenges. The question of who will pay for this, whether it's private spending, whether it's increase in taxation, or whether it's borrowing from future generations, that is the biggest question I think that we're facing. But if this is realized, we can lock in short and long-term savings from decreased fossil fuel consumption and can create opportunities if we are, I suppose, manufacturing and providing services for part of this low carbon economy within the Irish economy. And the current energy security and affordability crisis increases the imperative for this transition. Here, I won't go through in detail this slide, but this shows that we also simulated a low fossil fuel price world and a high fossil fuel price world. And in a high fossil fuel price world, which we are in now, the additional cost of meeting net zero world is actually lower because the bit below the line, which is the decrease in fossil fuel consumption, is higher. So if we go back to this slide about what happens after 2030, it's clear that because of the urgency of climate change, the slow progress, and the fact that we're feeling the impacts of climate change already, the world will need not just to go to zero as quickly as possible, but to go below zero. And that will require mobilization of resources this decade, not just in the following decades, but for example, no new fossil fuel burning equipment, restoring forests and wetlands. This has a long lead time, but is essential to meeting this carbon drawdown. Mobilize private and public sector innovation to solve hard to abate decarbonisation. That is not something that we can delay. And as well, reorientating planning to enable low carbon, low energy lifestyles. So building cheap, affordable housing close to people's work. That is what that means. So these are all actions that are needed this decade to be able to realize that blue line.
And I just have 1 minute left here for your slot.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I'm just on my last slide. So the key takeaways are that the carbon budgets are really the minimum that we have to do. And the most emission savings this decade actually come from well-developed solutions. That's electric cars, that's wind and solar. That is bioenergy, which have to be deployed with urgency, and raising the upfront finance to achieve this. And I suppose removing those political, the social, the economic barriers to delivering these well-developed solutions is the major challenge that we face now. A portfolio approach of all measures for all sectors is essential, and there's a huge prize if we achieve this infrastructure, institutions and capacity, carbon drawdown, nature restoration and human thriving within these planetary limits. And I think as well, it's important to know that COVID-19 demonstrated the capacity of us all together, society, policymakers, scientists, to act with this kind of urgency and solidarity that is required to meet this challenge. And this was very much a team effort. And I'm sorry that Dr. Balyk was not able to attend today, but he played a very, very large role in developing the model behind this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I see some questions coming through there in the Q&A function, and we will keep those till after all 3 presentations have been made. So then I will hand over to Professor Brian Ó Gallachóir, who's giving the second presentation.
Thank you very much, Karen. So Hannah has very clearly laid out some of the I suppose challenges and opportunities associated with the ambition that Ireland has set itself, and the in particular how we might meet these carbon budgets. And what I'd like to do is take that conversation a bit forward by focusing on what actually happened in terms of emissions during 2021. So how does the trajectory or the pathway we need to follow, how is that reflected in what we're currently doing? And just to start, I'll show some of the kind of key takeaway points from this presentation. So we do have this very strong political support for climate ambition, and we can't really, I suppose, overstate the importance of that and how that has changed in the last few years. We have this clear legislative framework for meeting these targets through the carbon budgets. Clearly, and as Hannah's presentation has shown, we have an urgent need to accelerate the energy transition. We do have this short-term carbon budget, which focuses on the period 2021 to 2025. And that's what I want to focus on. Sometimes we have a tendency in policy discourse to think about 2030, so 80% RESI by 2030, and the ambitions for electric vehicles by 2030. But I want to focus on this current 5-year period. Based on the provisional data from 2021, Ireland is not on track. And this means that greater emission reductions will be required in this year and the 3 years following. And post-COVID recovery is pointing to even higher emissions than 2021 in 2022. And that's at this stage. I mean, obviously, we're only at May, and we still have over half the year to go, but it's not looking promising in that way. And this points to the final comment about this disconnect between ambition and action. So we have a very strong level of climate ambition, but we don't have a corresponding level of climate action. So just before looking at 2021, maybe to reflect on the period up to then, and this is just looking at the period from the 15-year period from 2005 to 2020. And you can see that over that period, the total greenhouse gas emissions, this excludes LULUCF, but the total greenhouse gas emissions, we saw a reduction over this period of 18%. And if you see on the top left, the most significant progress we've made have been in emissions reduction in the electricity sector, where we nearly halved our emissions in that 15-year period. And this was, in that time frame, electricity demand grew by close to 15%. So it's not that we reduced energy demand. In that instance, what we did was change the energy supply with a really significant switch towards gas-fired generation and wind energy. We also see a reduction in the middle there, top on transportation. But we need to bear in mind that this includes the year 2020, where we had the COVID lockdown situation, which would have contributed a significant portion of that. But even taking that aside, we still did see reductions in emissions over the 15-year period in transportation, equally in heat. While we did see then these reductions in energy-related emissions in that 15-year period, we did see a growth of 5% of emissions in agriculture. So these emission reductions, these percentages are over the 15-year period. So they're not annual, they're over the 15-year period. But if we reflect on that 18% reduction over a 15-year period, what we're now looking to achieve is a 51% reduction over a decade. So a much higher level of emissions reduction over a shorter time frame. And I just want to reflect on this change in the in political leadership. I think it's very important that we see here. This is a snapshot from the voting in July of last year on the legislation. And this legislation, as I say, set the ambition for Ireland to achieve the second highest in the world level of emissions reduction. And that strong level of cross-party political support is really an essential ingredient in terms of trying to achieve climate action. And it does mark a significant change compared to previously. It gives a sense of hope and a sense of promise from the political system. Now, having said that, then when we see situations like discussions around cycleways in Salt Hill, or in terms of the discussions around commercial peat, ceasing commercial peat, we get a different perspective when this translates into individual actions. But at a high level, the party political support is very strong. So what this means then in terms of the legislation, what it gives is these two red dots. So we have this emission reduction trajectory until 2030, and then tending towards climate neutrality by 2050. And relative to the past 30 years, we can see it's the level of ambition that's contained within that. So the legislation provided the target point, if you like, and it's only through the carbon budgets then that we got the emissions pathway. And this is an indicative pathway here to meet these carbon budgets. It's worth pointing out that the Oireachtas approved these carbon budgets without the need for a vote. Again, reflecting this significant high-level political support for climate action. And so rather than having, what the carbon budgets do is they translate this 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to effectively 5-yearly carbon budgets, mandatory carbon budgets over a 5-yearly period. And this is a game changer in terms of translating longer term or medium term targets into much shorter term requirements from the system. But the challenge is facing us is that we're not on track. And you can see that from the green bar represented here. So early estimates for Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions suggest that we're somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million tonnes above the target amount. There is uncertainty in this. These are very provisional numbers, and the numbers we've generated are based strongly on the monthly energy data provided very usefully by Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. But I will point out that the numbers here that I'm going to show don't reflect we haven't adjusted these to take account of the provisional energy balance that was produced more recently for 2021 by SEAI. So these are based on the monthly data, and there are some differences. But I will draw your attention to the fact that because we haven't met our target for 2021 on this indicative pathway, that means that the level of ambition the level of climate action that's required in the subsequent years to 2025 is higher to remain within the carbon budget. So it's not that we have a target for 2025, we have a carbon budget for the period 2021 to 2025. So early action can help us to provide a cushion to meet that carbon budget target, but delayed action means that we're in trouble and we need to do more, and that's a significant challenge, particularly in the context, as I mentioned, of 2022. The signs are that 2022 is likely to be, based on current information, is on a trajectory to be higher than 2021. So this is really challenging in the context of these carbon budgets and how we might meet these carbon budgets. And I think it does reflect, as I say, this disconnect between the level of ambition we have and the action to meet that ambition. So that was total greenhouse gas emissions. Taking a closer look then at just the energy-related CO2 emissions, you can see here that what I'm showing here is the monthly data for energy-related CO2 emissions. In the purple shaded area, we have the data from the period 2018 to 2020, so the last few years, to give a sense of a context. And then we can see the green line representing the data in 2021. And as you can see in the first quarter, the green line represents, shows data that's lower than that, than the numbers in the period 2018 to 2020. But of course, in the first quarter of 2021, we still had some very significant COVID pandemic restrictions. What we can also see clearly here is that from in the latter part of the year, we see that the energy-related CO2 emissions are above the numbers that we saw for the period 2018 to 2020. And this is the worrying indication coming from this provisional data. On the bottom, you can see broadly the sectoral, within energy, the different sectoral trends. So we've a 25% increase in emissions from electricity generation, a 6% increase in transport, and a 1% reduction in heat, with this overall growth of 8%. Now, as I mentioned, we do have the energy balance has been published more recently, and certainly for the electricity figures, the numbers coming from the energy balance suggest that the emissions are lower than a 25% growth. But this does give a sense of the challenge. And if we've also, what we've done is looking at removing the first 3 months to see how that impacts on things. And if we remove the first 3 months, we see that the emissions in 2021, without removing the first 3 months, were 3% lower than 2018. But if we remove the first 3 months, emissions were 2% higher than 2018 levels. If we zoom in then on electricity related emissions, as I mentioned, the growth from the monthly energy figures suggest an increase of 25%. It is less than that, as I mentioned, from the energy balance. And part of what we think is happening there is some of the data associated with coal use is from Moneypoint, but it includes the oil burning as well, which would have a lower emissions footprint. But the overall trend is still very clear, that particularly, again, as I say, in the latter part of the year, we see this increase in electricity-related CO2 emissions. And this was largely due to the increased use of coal in our electricity generation mix, and also the growth in electricity demand and the growth in data centers being a particularly strong driver here. And again, if you look at the bottom right, the comment here that the electricity emissions in 2021 were 1% above 2018 levels, but 10% above if we remove the first quarter from this data. If we look at transport emissions, here we see clearly the impact of the COVID pandemic restrictions in the first 3 months, with the 2021 data being lower than the data in 2018 to 2020. But then as we emerge from the pandemic, we see this tendency towards a recovery, if you like, as the economy recovered, and transport emissions then growing over the period of the second quarter and into the third quarter. In terms of heat, we see a slightly different picture in the sense that we don't see a significant growth relative to 2018 to 2020, but nor do we see a decline. So we have had a significant focus on retrofitting in this period, and we have seen a lot of measures to reduce emissions associated with heat. But what we're seeing from the data is effectively a stubbornness in the data, in that the emissions, we're not seeing a decline in emissions on the heat side.
Brian, sorry, just 1 minute left, please.
Okay, thank you. And effectively, that's a challenge for us as we look at policy going forward. Now, in terms of what we need to do to address this, we do have strong ambitions in the climate action plan associated with individual measures. So we need to accelerate those very significantly, accelerate the reduction of fossil fuels, accelerate the increase in renewable energy deployment. But bullet point 2 is important there. We need to ensure there's sufficient redundancy so that if one measure fails, there is sufficient backup elsewhere in the system. This is important in the context of the plans should seek to overachieve so that the failings in one area will not mean that we fail to meet the target. And just one point on the need to focus on emissions reduction, to shift the conversation, if you like, from individual measures to overall emissions reduction. And what you're seeing here is 2 different pathways to an 80% RES-E share of electricity. And in these 2 different pathways, we get very different results in terms of emissions. So on the bottom, you can see here that we can have 80% of our electricity from renewables, but that can lead to emissions of 2 million tons or 4.4 million tons, just looking at these scenarios. And what's important there is to look not just at the renewable share of electricity, but overall electricity demand, particularly the growth of data centers, the interconnection flows, and also the smartness of the system in terms of response to the increased share of renewable energy. So I'd close just with these key takeaway points. And I suppose the particular one I wanted to draw your attention to is number 8 here, this disconnect we have now between climate ambition and climate action. That's the key message I think this data sends us in the context of what we need to do, not between now and 2030, but between now and 2025.
Thank you very much, Brian. I see the questions are coming in the Q&A function. Thank you everyone for that. So now the third presentation, Dr. Fionn Rogan and Dr. Tomas Uidhir, I'll hand over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And hi, everybody. Great to be here. So my presentation with Tomas will be on the scale-up challenges and on the interaction effects of different decarbonisation policy measures. And we'll focus on the transport sector. And the 3 research questions that inform this presentation. First, how precedented is the electric vehicle target of 845,000 electric vehicles by 2030? Is it precedented or unprecedented? When we look at all passenger transport policy measures, what is the interaction effect between all these policy measures? Electric vehicles, biofuels, public transport, working from home and active modes. And lastly, how can policy support the scaling up that's required to achieve these targets? So looking at the first research question, and this question is based on research that Tomas, Brian, John, and myself across the UCC and ESRI that was recently published. And we were looking at both electric vehicles and deep retrofitting ambition. We wanted to understand if there was a precedent for the level of ambition in Ireland. Now, we started this research a number of years ago, and it just got published. So I'll present some findings initially on the electric vehicle target. And this graph here shows the electric vehicle sales that would be required to achieve this the 2030 targets. Now, as I said, this work from a number of years ago initially used the old target of 840,000. So, and we were using 2019 as a base year. So in 2019, there was just under 5,000 electric vehicle sales, both battery and plug-in hybrids. And the pathway to achieve 840,000 by 2030 would require this level of increase in sales. So about 140,000 sales of EVs in 2030. We wanted to understand if there was a precedent for this. So at the time, and still, Norway is the country with the highest sales of electric vehicles in the world. And using a modeling methodology detailed in the paper, we mimicked the level of scale up achieved in Norway in Ireland, and we developed a Norway precedent for Ireland. And this scenario got us to about 200,000 electric vehicles by 2030 in Ireland, assuming the same level of take-up as in Norway. So this shows a significant gap, obviously, between the precedent of Norway and Ireland's policy ambition. So clearly our ambition was higher than that, was quite unprecedented. This modeling worked from a number of years ago. Now we have sales data for the last number of years, so we can compare our scenarios with the actual sales data. And when we do that, we see that the EV sales for 2020 were almost exactly the same as the Norway scenario, but significantly above for 2021. Now, our Norway scenario, we didn't predict the pandemic and the kind of sales that came with that. But there are a number of factors feeding into the level of EV sales over the last number of years. There was a downward pressure in 2020, and there's been an increase in demand, particularly in the last year since the war and the subsequent impact on fossil fuels. But there are a lot of supply chain pressures on EVs, which are putting downward pressure on the sales for EVs. So the sales of EVs have been unprecedented, based on the Norway precedent, but they are still below the level required to achieve Ireland's target. When we did a more recent scenario to look at what level of sales would require to meet the new target of 145,000, there's an even more dramatic scale up. And just to give you a sense for what this looks like compared to total car sales. So total car sales over the last number of years, both new and imports, have been between 140 and 200,000. So by 2030, nearly all of that would need to be electric vehicles, and there are challenges with imports due to Brexit as well. So if you were looking at this graph of this scale up EVs and you thought that's very hard, that's not going to happen, you wouldn't sound completely crazy. But the challenge is, if we don't meet this scale up of EVs, as has been pointed out by both Hannah and Brian, there will be a shortfall in emissions reduction then for other sectors, because it's not just electric vehicles, there's a great range of policy measures. So looking at a different set of scenarios now on the emissions from passenger transport, and these two lines here are two scenarios over the next decade. So the base year of 2018, the reference year of 2018, and a black line here is the reference scenario of what we expect emissions from passenger transport. So that's private cars and public transport, what emissions would be over the next decade if there was no real change in policy. And our dotted line is our own mitigation scenario, where we model a 62% reduction in passenger transport emissions. Now, the majority of this emissions reduction is coming from the a large amount of electric vehicles, with nearly 80% of those electric vehicles battery electric vehicles. But we also see emissions reduction from biofuels, from E10 and B20. And we developed additional scenarios that went above the existing policy ambition. So our biofuels and electric vehicles that we're modeling here, using the LEAP model, these are the same as the policy targets currently in place. But we looked at a higher level of public transport electrification, so full electrification of buses and trains by 2030. The 500,000 additional active mode trips, but also additional cycling, school transport, buses and electric bikes. And we also looked at a high level of working from home of 2 days per week, and just to see what level of ambition could be achieved. And this scenario is, as I said, our own scenario, but this is of the order of magnitude that needs to be achieved for passenger transport. So you can see here the centrality of electric vehicles, that if electric vehicles don't deliver the level of sales, there would be a shortfall in emissions in them. And related to this, we pose the question, what is the interaction effect between all these policy measures? So how do they interact with each other? And I'm going to pause here just to reflect on what exactly is the interaction effect between policy measures. And so this graph shows what we mean by interaction effect. And we have imagine a very simple country where there's only two policy measures. So there's policy measure A and policy measure B. Policy measure A saves 10 units and policy measure B saves 15 units. So if you want a really simple analysis would be to add these savings together and you get simply 25 units saved. But the way policy measures will in reality interact with each other, there will be three different types of interaction. So when you look at the interaction of those two policy measures, you might have a mitigating effect where the net effect is that the savings is less than the two measures added together. The effect might be neutral, there might be no interaction effect, so you get the same as the sum, or you might get a reinforcing interaction effect where the combination of the two policy measures adds up to more than the two policy measures separately. So this framework we took from the academic literature, and we decided to apply it to our analysis of the passenger transport sector. So the 5 different types of policy measures that we have been modeling are here on this table. So we've got modal shift, we've got electrified public transport, 845,000 electric vehicles, high levels of biofuel blending, and working from home 2 days a week, and the civil service target of 20%. So we did a suite of scenario analysis to look at the interaction between these policy measures. And the first one I present here is the interaction between if we have high levels of electric vehicles and we electrify public transport, and we look at the interaction between these two policy measures, and they are neutral because they are actually focusing on different sectors. So we can have both of these policy measures in place, and they wouldn't reduce or increase the emission savings because they're looking at separate sectors. Most interaction effects between policy measures do lead to slightly less emission savings. And a good example here is the interaction effect between biofuel blending and electric vehicles. And that leads to in this scenario, 7% reduction in emissions savings. So if there was biofuel blending in a country without any electric vehicles, there would be a lot more biofuels in the system. So when we combine different policy measures, we usually get between 2 and 7% reduction in emission savings because of that interaction effect. And this points to the diminishing returns we get from policy measures, and also the fact that it gets harder to decarbonize as we increase our ambition. So the low-hanging fruit is gone at this stage, and it becomes harder and harder, and the stakes for each policy measure become more important because a reduction in ambition will lead to a shortfall. But a very interesting interaction effect we discovered was between electrifying public transport and higher levels of modal shift to public transport. And this actually led to a dividend in emission savings. So the emission savings from these two policy measures were 13% higher than the emission savings from the two measures by themselves. And this actually makes sense that if you electrify public transport but also have more people using public transport and they're not using other modes, you will get this this reinforcing the synergy between these two policy measures. So the emission savings here is 13%. That reflects high ambition that we're modeling, but it is an exception to the diminishing returns that are achieved elsewhere. So certainly of interest, I think, given the scale of the challenges and the already increasing emissions that we're seeing in passenger transport, as Brian outlined. So this analysis of the interaction effect left us one final question. So how can policy support scaling up to achieve these emissions? And we looked at academic literature on two categories of consumer here. And one is the early adopter, and the other is the mainstream adopter, so the mainstream market actors. And the academic literature points to quite a lot of differences in between these two types of consumers. And the early adopters, their attitude to risk and information and motivation is quite different. So they tend to be both wealthier, more motivated by environmental concerns, quite active searchers for information. They often tend to be researchers, and they're more comfortable kind of taking risks, and they perceive benefits more strongly. On the other hand, the mainstream adopters have quite a different set of characteristics. There's a lot of information on this graph, but the ones in red I want to highlight that for mainstream market actors, they're much more motivated by either economics or a need for compliance. So from the example of buying an electric vehicle, if it's more cheap, or if they simply have no choice, that's when they would do that. Also, the way mainstream market adopters pick up information, it's much more. They're not active kind of researchers for information. They just pick up the kind of knowledge that tends to come in the media or through their circular friends or contacts. So this focusing on these characteristics will be really key to for the dramatic level of scale up that will be required, as we've seen. So wrapping up, so my three research questions that I posed at the start: how precedented is 845,000 electric vehicles by 2030? So recent EV sales have been unprecedented, but they're still below the level required to reach the 2030 target. In terms of the interaction effect between passenger transport policy measures, that usually reduces CO2 emission savings by 2 to 7% in our scenarios. The exception is increased usage and electrification of public transport, which can increase CO2 savings. So one to focus on. And how can policy support the level of scaling up by focusing on the attributes of mainstream adopters? So thanks very much. That's my email address, and I'm happy to follow up with Q&A and to share any of our research findings as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fionn. So we can start the Q&A session now. There's a couple of questions that have been strongly upvoted. The first one is for Hannah Daley, and it's from Dara McCoy. So in the reference scenario presented, i.e. energy system at net zero emissions by 2030, could you give an overview of required generation, mix, storage, interconnection, etc., and your view on the feasibility of achieving this target?
Hi, Dara. Thanks for the great question. So just for clarity, in the scenario that I presented, it was the electricity system which reached net zero, and the energy system, which includes transport, heating and industry, also reaches net zero by 2050. And as for your question about what is the required generation mix, I can share the specific details of the investment in solar, PV, wind, onshore and offshore, and interconnection. This is one illustrative pathway, and I suppose I don't personally take a stance on whether that's achievable or not. It is something like someone who builds a map, I'm going to use the map analogy again, presents an option on the route, and if the people, the decision makers who are kind of trying to collectively decide what the best pathway forward for everybody is, decides that one path isn't feasible, then we look at alternatives. So we run other scenarios where, for example, the power system doesn't decarbonize if the SNSP limit can't be raised to over 95% by that time. For some specific answers, I suppose we assume the interconnection, that the Celtic and East-West interconnector go ahead as planned, and that the imports net exports kind of net off to zero. That overall renewables capacity roughly doubles by 2025 and quadruples by 2030. So we assume that offshore wind is already strongly growing at 2 gigawatts of total capacity by 2025, which I understand, especially reading this weekend's Sunday newspapers, that that may be infeasible, and that grows to 7 gigawatts by 2030.
Thanks for that, Hannah. So then the second question that has been upvoted is a question for Brian. It's from Dennis Kelly. And he asks, how does Brian see disturbed local energy storage and district heating making an impact, and to what timeline beyond 2025?
Thanks, Dennis. Great question. I presume it's distributed. You meant to write rather than disturbed, but maybe I'm wrong there. I think what effectively what has come across from the three presentations is an emphasis that we need everything and more for this to happen. So in that context, distributed energy storage and indeed large-scale energy storage would both be very important pieces of the jigsaw, but maybe in different contexts. So for example, one of the interesting things that can be explored in the context of, say, data centers would be 24/7 green electricity, and that would effectively point to one of the options being having local energy storage on site to enable and to ensure that. In the context of district heating, we've seen very little examples of that in an Irish context. We have seen this very interesting example in Tallaght associated with the data centre, and also we've seen from the SEAI heat study a very strong emphasis on the need for district heating. So certainly there are things that, along with the other aspects that that have been more prominently focused on, these are also things that will be required in the jigsaw. In terms of to what timeline beyond 2025, I'd say they're different. They're in different timelines. In terms of the local energy storage would be an easier thing to manage and incorporate than, for example, district heating, given the level of infrastructure change that would be required to deliver district heating. So what I would say is that both of them are important parts of the mix that's required in the context of all the other elements as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So the next question then is a question for Professor Daley again, and it's from Nicholas Vavis. He asks, regarding the Times Ireland model, is there a particular reason why geothermal energy has not been included as a renewable option in the list?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, deep geothermal is a very promising technology, and I suppose what we have included in the Times model are kind of well developed and well studied, low carbon solutions for which there is there are deployment plans, and that there is an kind of well understood cost. I think one of our priorities coming up is to look especially at SEAI's national heat study, which looked at the potential for geothermal, especially in the context of district heating. So I think we want to bring insights from that into the next iteration of our study. So thank you for raising it.
Thanks, Hannah. I think the next question is also probably directed towards you. It's about infrastructure, and the question is, given timelines to build infrastructure in Ireland, how can we decarbonise the power sector by 2028? There's also another one in infrastructure from Paul O'Donnell about mobilising €60 billion in investment. You might be able to take them together.
Yeah, I think, Karen, no one more than yourself kind of understands the I suppose the huge lift that's going to be required. And for example, if we can't, so the reason that I suppose the model sees as a huge priority decarbonising the power sector as rapidly as possible is not only is it kind of an emitting sector itself, it is the main feasible way that we can decarbonise industry, transport and buildings, because it is the largest, I suppose, potential for low carbon fuel, which is electricity through renewables. So I suppose the level of decarbonisation of the power sector is a function of what we assume is feasible, and we can't say what that is from an engineering or an economic perspective. That feasibility is really driven by institutions, policy, by workforce and by supply chains. And we can say something about the feasibility of let's say reaching a scale up in EV targets, but you can't take this engineering economic approach to understanding feasibility of all those targets. And I suppose taking a step back, it's why that political and social scientists and kind of political economists have played a much bigger role of late, especially in IPCC reports, in understanding what are these barriers to the deployment of technologies that we already know are often both cheaper, healthier, and lower carbon than the status quo. And so you kind of need a different skill set, I suppose, than what we have. Our model represents what is necessary, but what is possible really depends on society together. That is really a big question, and it's again the same with mobilizing finance. I would say that is outside our skill set, but I think it's a conversation that is necessary to have urgently.
Thank you, Hannah. So there's a question then on biofuels from Maeve Connolly. She asks, how much biofuels in terawatt hours can we produce indigenously in Ireland? How will this impact on food security? How reliant will this make us on imported fuels? Yeah,
and again, that's a question of how long is a piece of string. I mean, feasibly, we could dedicate all of our agricultural land to producing biofuels. That would be, terrible for the agriculture sector, probably terrible for nature, and would just kind of and potentially would cause all sorts of other unintended consequences. So there's a real spectrum of what we can produce. We assumed we took our maximum amount in the kind of base scenario of bioenergy from SEAI's 2015 heat study. So we haven't updated that yet to SEAI's latest heat study, which looked at about a quadrupling of indigenous bioenergy production by 2030. And that is kind of compliant with the EU's sustainability directive. So I suppose the model, again, like the power sector, would favor as much bioenergy as possible, and it is only by constraining it or kind of adding a cost that we limit that. So if the SEAI's heat study indicates that additional bioenergy from grass could be produced with a reduction in livestock numbers. There are sustainability concerns about biogas, for example. If methane leakage is high, you can actually induce substantial warming if you're not capturing all that methane. So there's a, I suppose, very careful trade-offs that have to be assessed, both for the farming sector, for nature, and for the energy system. And your question about how this would impact on food security, I mean, 90% of the food that we produce in Ireland is exported, mainly as kind of luxury goods to high-income countries. So, I see food security as being, I suppose, the threat of famine in really underdeveloped countries. So I can't imagine us reducing our exports would have a large impact on food security.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So in the final 2 minutes we have for Q&A, there's a question for Professor Ó Gallachóir. So Paul Price, he says that the presentations show just how urgent and rapid Paris Agreement aligned climate action must be. Is far more effort required to communicate this to the public and businesses, and what should be emphasised most?
Karen, and thanks, Paul, for the question. I think communication is only one part of it. Sometimes what we find is that if people think and feel they're being talked at, they mightn't necessarily engage constructively with the topic. So I think what's more important than communication is engagement, dialogue, and discourse. And we've seen through initiatives like the Citizens Assembly or other sort of versions of similar, like mini publics, and these new methods of deliberative processes for engagement on these topics is what's required at significant scale. And in that we can draw out what I suppose the views of citizens and communities are, and to support them in finding solutions that will reduce emissions. We've seen this very strongly on the Dingle Peninsula, where we didn't go in with solutions, or we went in with a kind of a perspective on support and enablement, and that was very fruitful. So in terms of certainly on the disconnect, I think we need to, and maybe the sectoral emission ceilings will provide a stronger lever, if you like, to have some discussions. In terms of what should be emphasized most in communications is, I think, emissions reduction rather than the individual targets per se, and to see what we can do to deliver those. Because the targets, the individual targets, are very important, but as Fionn showed in his presentation, it depends very much what else is happening at the same time. So I think rather than communication, it's discourse and dialogue, active discourse and dialogue, and the emphasis on emissions reduction. Thank you.
So that then concludes our Q&A session. I'd just like to say thanks to our presenters, Hannah, Brian and Fionn.